At 5:30 a.m., Tom McKenzie stood on what was left of his once mighty ranch, 5 frozen acres, and a life shattered by death, debt, and silence. His wife, gone, his body, breaking, and his last bull, Atlas, hadn't moved from the spot where his mate died not for 3 months. The snow stacked on the bison-sized beast's back like time itself giving up on him. Tom knew grief, but what he saw in Atlas's eyes that morning wasn't just loss. It was surrender. That bull was dying on his feet, until something else stepped out of the fog.Massive, wild and fully alive. A bison. Tom's knees buckled. He hadn't seen one on his land in 40 years. But this wasn't a return. It was a challenge. And that bison? It wasn't here to mourn. It was here to wake the dead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The frost clung to everything like death's own fingerprints, painting Tom McKenzie's world in shades of defeat. At 5:30 a.m., the Montana sky hadn't yet decided between night and day, leaving the valley suspended in that gray limbo that matched Tom's soul perfectly. He stood on the sagging porch of his cabin, coffee mug trembling in arthritic hands, surveying what remained of 4 decades of dreams. 5 acres. That's what was left of the McKenzie Ranch, 5 measly acres carved from the bones of what had once been 500 acres of prime Montana grazing land. The bank had taken the rest 18 months ago, along with most of his cattle, his pride, and any illusion that hard work and honest living guaranteed a damn thing in this world. "Come on, Whiskers," Tom muttered to the orange tabby weaving between his legs. The cat had appeared during Margaret's final weeks, a scrawny kitten with mismatched eyes, one green, one gold, who'd somehow known that a dying woman and her grieving husband needed something small and alive to anchor them to hope. Now Whiskers was all he had left of those final, precious days when Margaret could still manage a smile at the kitten's antics. The barn loomed ahead, its red paint peeling like scabs. Tom's boots crunched through frost-stiffened grass as he made his way to the feed bins, Whiskers trotting beside him with that peculiar feline gait that suggested she owned the world and was merely allowing him to visit. But today, something was different about the cat's behavior. Instead of her usual morning routine of investigating every corner for mice, she kept glancing toward the far pasture, her tail twitching with an anxiety Tom had never seen before. "What's got into you, girl?" he asked, but Whiskers just mewed and patted ahead, leading him toward the source of her concern. That's when Tom saw him. Atlas stood motionless in the exact spot where Rosie had died 3 months ago. The massive Hereford bull, all 2,000 pounds of him, looked like a monument to grief, his red and white coat dull and patchy, his once proud head hanging low. Snow had collected on his broad back, and he hadn't bothered to shake it off. He simply stood there, staring at the ground where his mate had drawn her last breath. Tom's chest tightened. When he'd bought Atlas and Rosie 8 years ago as breeding stock for the larger ranch, they'd been a bonded pair, inseparable, devoted, the kind of animal love story that made even hardened ranchers go soft. Atlas had never been more than a few yards from Rosie's side. They grazed together, rested together, faced every storm and season as a unit. When the disease took Rosie sudden, vicious, unstoppable, it had carved out Atlas's heart along with hers. "Jesus boy," Tom whispered, approaching the bull slowly. "You can't keep doing this to yourself." Atlas didn't acknowledge him. The bull's ribs showed through his winter coat, sharp ridges that spoke of meals refused and a body consuming itself with grief. Tom had seen depression in cattle before. It wasn't uncommon after losing a mate or calf, but nothing like this. Atlas wasn't just mourning. He was disappearing, one day at a time. The feed trough sat untouched, yesterday's hay still frozen in neat piles. Tom kicked at it, scattering the waste. That made 3 days running. 3 days without Atlas eating anything substantial. At this, Rate. The bull would be dead before the month was out. Tom's mind drifted to the manila envelope sitting on his kitchen table, the foreclosure notice that had arrived like a death sentence 2 years ago. He could still taste the bile that had risen in his throat as he'd read the cold, legal language that translated to, "You've lost everything." Margaret had been in her final decline then, the cancer eating through her as relentlessly as it devoured. Their savings, the medical bills, the experimental treatments, the desperate last-ditch efforts to buy more time, it had all added up to numbers that made grown men weep. "We should have sold sooner," he'd told Margaret one night as she lay skeletal and yellow in their bed. "Should have seen it coming. Thomas McKenzie," she'd whispered, her voice like autumn leaves. "You don't give up on the things you love just because they get hard. You hear me? You don't give up." But Margaret was gone now, and Atlas was dying, and Tom was tired bone deep, soul-sick, tired of fighting battles he couldn't win. The smart thing, the practical thing, would be to call Dr. Chun and end Atlas's suffering before it got worse. One injection, and the bull would slip away peacefully, finally reunited with his Rosie in whatever green pastures awaited beyond this frozen hell. Whiskers brushed against Tom's legs again, and he looked down to find her staring at Atlas with an intensity that made his skin prickle. The cat's mismatched eyes were fixed on the bull with something that looked almost like understanding. She took a few steps toward Atlas, stopped, looked back at Tom, then repeated the gesture. "What are you trying to tell me, girl?" Whiskers mewed once, sharp and insistent, then trotted directly to Atlas's massive front hooves. The bull's head moved slightly, the first sign of awareness Tom had seen from him in days. Atlas looked down at the small cat with eyes that held depths of sadness Tom could barely fathom. For a moment, the three of them formed a strange tableau in the gray morning light: a broken old man, a grieving bull, and a cat who seemed to understand something the other two had forgotten. Then Atlas shifted his weight, and Tom caught sight of the bull's water trough bone dry, ice crystals clinging to its metal edges. "Damn it, Atlas, you haven't been drinking either." Tom shuffled to the pump, his joints protesting every movement. 68 years old, and he felt every single one of them this morning. As he worked the handle, sending cold water splashing into the trough, he caught himself calculating costs. Feed bills, veterinary expenses, the simple economics of keeping a dying animal alive when money was tighter than bark on a tree. Margaret's voice echoed in his memory. "You don't give up on the things you love just because they get hard." But what if love wasn't enough? What if sometimes the kindest thing was to let go? Whiskers had stationed herself beside Atlas now, sitting primly in the snow, her orange fur bright against the bull's dark hooves. She looked like a sentinel, a guardian, a small flame of defiance against the encroaching darkness. Tom finished filling the water trough and stepped back, watching as Atlas slowly, painfully, lowered his massive head to drink. It was the first water the bull had taken in Tom's presence for over a week. "Maybe there's still some fight left in you after all," Tom murmured. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. Atlas was fading, and no amount of hope or stubbornness could change that. By tomorrow, he'd have to make the call that had been haunting his dreams for weeks. He'd have to choose between mercy and miracles, between practical compassion and the slim chance that love might still matter in a world that seemed determined to take everything he cared about. Whiskers mewed again, softer this time, and settled more comfortably beside Atlas's hooves. The bull's breathing seemed to steady slightly, as if the cat's presence offered some small comfort in his vast loneliness. Tom turned toward the cabin, his decision crystallizing with each step. He'd give it one more night, one last chance for Atlas to show some sign of recovery. Then, tomorrow morning, he'd call Dr. Chun and do what needed to be done. What he didn't know was that Whiskers had already made a different decision entirely. As Tom's footsteps faded toward the house, the small cat looked up at the massive bull towering above her and began to plan an intervention that would change all their lives forever. Tom made the call at 11:43 a.m. After finding Atlas collapsed beside the water trough like a mountain that had finally surrendered to gravity. The bull's massive frame lay sprawled in the muddy snow, his breathing shallow and labored, his eyes rolled back to show too much white. For a terrifying moment, Tom thought he'd waited too long, that Atlas had already slipped away while he'd been inside nursing his third cup of coffee and wrestling with cowardice. "Come on, big fella," Tom whispered, dropping to his knees beside the bull's enormous head. His arthritic joints screamed in protest, but he ignored them, pressing his weathered palm against Atlas's neck to feel for a pulse. The heartbeat was. "They're weak, irregular, but there. Don't you dare give up on me now." Atlas's eyes fluttered, focusing briefly on Tom's face before drifting closed again. It was the first real eye contact they'd shared in weeks, and it hit Tom like a punch to the gut. In that brief moment of recognition, he saw everything Atlas had been: proud, strong, devoted, and everything he was becoming: a shadow, a ghost, a creature too lost in grief to remember how to live. Whiskers appeared at Tom's elbow, her orange fur stark against the dirty snow. She sniffed at Atlas's massive nostrils, then looked up at Tom with those mismatched eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than any cat had a right to possess. Her expression was unmistakable. "Do something." Tom's fingers shook as he dialed Dr. Sarah Chun's number. He'd been putting off this call for weeks, telling himself that Atlas just needed time, that grief was natural, that things would improve. But there was no denying the evidence sprawled before him in the mud. Atlas was dying, and Tom's stubborn hope had only prolonged his suffering. "Cascade Valley Veterinary. This is Elena. This is Tom McKenzie. I need Dr. Chun out here right away. It's my bull Atlas. He's bad. Is it an emergency, Mr. McKenzie?" Tom looked at Atlas's labored breathing, at the ribs showing through his dull coat, at the resignation in those massive brown eyes. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think it is." Dr. Chun arrived within the hour, her white pickup truck crunching up the gravel drive with the urgency Tom had requested. Sarah Chun was 32, fresh-faced and determined, with the kind of earnest competence that reminded Tom of Margaret in her younger days. She'd taken over old Doc Hartwell's practice 6 months ago, bringing with her modern equipment and an optimism that rural Montana had a way of grinding down over time. "How long has he been like this?" Dr. Chun asked, crouching beside Atlas with her medical bag. Her hands moved over the bull's body with practiced efficiency, checking pulse, respiration, temperature, the condition of his eyes and gums. "He collapsed this morning, but he's been failing for months. Ever since we lost Rosie." Tom's voice cracked on his late cow's name. "They were bonded, you know, 8 years together. Never saw one without the other." Dr. Chun nodded, her expression grave as she continued her examination. She'd heard about the legendary devotion between Atlas and Rosie from other ranchers in the valley. Stories like theirs were rare, the kind of animal love affair that made cynics believe in soulmates. "His temperature is dangerously low," she said, wrapping her stethoscope around her neck. "Severe dehydration, muscle atrophy, and his heart rate is erratic. Mr. McKenzie, I need to be honest with you. What we're looking at here is clinical depression manifesting as failure to thrive. In cattle, especially in bonded pairs like Atlas and Rosie, the surviving animal can literally die." Oh, grief. Tom felt the words hit him like physical blows. "Is there anything we can do? Medicine, supplement, something?" Dr. Chun sat back on her heels, her young face etched with the kind of compassion that costs veterinarians sleep. "I've seen this before, though rarely to this extreme. The problem isn't physical, it's emotional. Atlas has lost his will to live. We can provide supportive care, 4 fluids, nutritional supplements, but without his desire to survive." She left the sentence hanging. "What are you saying?" I'm saying that sometimes the kindest thing we can do is prevent further suffering. Dr. Chun's voice was gentle but firm. Atlas is in pain, Mr. McKenzie. Not just physical pain, but a kind of emotional anguish that we can't treat with medicine. The humane option would be euthanasia. The word hung in the cold air like a curse. Tom had known it was coming, had been preparing himself for weeks, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that stole his breath. Whiskers, who had been sitting quietly beside Atlas's head, suddenly stood and arched her back, hissing at Dr. Chun with uncharacteristic aggression. "Whiskers, no," Tom said sharply, but the cat ignored him, positioning herself between the veterinarian and Atlas like a tiny, furious guardian. Dr. Chin looked surprised. "That's unusual behavior. Is she normally protective of the cattle?" "No," Tom admitted. "She's never shown much interest in the livestock before. But lately, she's been acting strange around Atlas, almost like she knows something's wrong." As if to prove his point, Whiskers settled beside Atlas's massive head and began an odd, rhythmic purring that seemed to resonate through the bull's body. Atlas's breathing visibly steadied and his eyes opened slightly, focusing on the small cat with something that might have been gratitude. Dr. Chen watched this interaction with growing fascination. "I've heard of emotional support animals, but this is remarkable. It's almost like she's trying to comfort him." "Yeah, well, comfort's not going to save his life," Tom said bitterly. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like the Montana sky before a storm. How would we do it? The euthanasia, I mean. A sedative first, then a barbiturate injection. He won't feel any pain. It's very peaceful. Dr. Chun's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing the young woman beneath who'd gone into veterinary medicine to heal animals, not to end their suffering. "I can schedule it for tomorrow morning if you'd like time to—" "Tomorrow morning," Tom interrupted. He couldn't bear to hear the rest of her sentence. Couldn't bear to think about saying goodbye, about Atlas drawing his last breath in the same spot where Rosie had died. First thing, Dr. Chun packed her equipment with the efficiency of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. "I'll bring everything I need, Mr. McKenzie. I want you to know that this is the right decision. Atlas is suffering, and prolonging it won't bring Rosie back." Tom nodded numbly, watching as she loaded her truck. The rational part of his mind knew she was right. The practical part understood that keeping Atlas alive in his current condition was selfish, even cruel. But the part of him that remembered Margaret's words about not giving up on the things you love screamed in protest. As Dr. Chun's truck disappeared down the drive, Tom found himself alone with Atlas and Whiskers in the gathering dusk. The cat had never left her position beside the bull's head, her purring a constant soothing vibration that seemed to be the only thing keeping Atlas calm. 18 hours, Tom said aloud, his voice rough with unshed tears. "That's all we've got left, boy." Atlas's eyes opened at the sound of his voice, and for a moment, Tom could swear he saw understanding there. Understanding, and perhaps forgiveness for the choice that would end his pain tomorrow. Whiskers looked up at Tom with those mismatched eyes, and he could have sworn she was making him a promise. "I won't let you face this alone." None of them knew that by morning, everything would change. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tom couldn't sleep. He'd tried, Lord knows he'd tried, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Atlas's massive form sprawled in the mud, those intelligent brown eyes filled with a resignation that mirrored his own. At 2:17 a.m., he gave up the pretense and padded to the kitchen in his worn slippers, brewing coffee that would be his fourth pot since dinner time. The cabin felt smaller at night, cramped with memories and regrets. Margaret's reading chair still sat by the window, her bookmark still marking page 247 of a romance novel she'd never finish. Her coffee mug, the one with the faded sunflower design, remained in the cupboard. Too sacred to use, too painful to pack away. Everything in this house was a museum to loss, and Tom was both curator and sole visitor. He'd spent the evening preparing Atlas's stall, spreading fresh straw and checking the gate latches with the obsessive care of a man trying to control the uncontrollable. Dr. Chun would arrive at 8 a.m. sharp, and by 8:30, Atlas would be at peace. The rational part of Tom's mind kept repeating this like a mantra. It was the right thing to do, the merciful thing, the only thing that made sense. So why did it feel like murder? Through the kitchen window, he could see the faint outline of the barn against the star-scattered sky. Atlians was in there, probably standing in that same grief-frozen posture, staring at shadows only he could see. Tom had moved him inside after Dr. Chun left, partly for warmth, partly because he couldn't bear the thought of the bull spending his final night in the spot where Rosie had died. Whiskers had followed them into the barn. Of course, the cat had been acting increasingly strange all evening, pacing between the house and the barn like a tiny orange sentinel, refusing her dinner, ignoring her favorite spots on the warm radiator. When Tom had finally secured Atlas in his stall and turned to leave, Whiskers had darted past him into the barn, disappearing into the shadows with purpose. Probably hunting mice, Tom had muttered, but something about her behavior nagged at him. Cats were creatures of habit, and Whiskers' habits didn't include nighttime barn expeditions now. Staring out at the dark building, Tom felt an inexplicable urge to check on them both. Maybe it was insomnia, maybe it was guilt, maybe it was just the desperate need to convince himself one more time that he was making the right choice. He pulled on his coat and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped into the bitter Montana night. The barn door creaked on its hinges, the sound unnaturally loud in the frozen silence. Tom's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating hay bales and farm equipment, before settling on Atlas's stall in the far corner. What he saw there stopped him dead in his tracks. Atlas was lying down, the first time Tom had seen him rest in weeks. The massive bull was stretched out on his side in the fresh straw, his breathing deep and even. But that wasn't what made Tom's heart skip a beat. It was Whiskers. The small orange cat was perched on Atlas's broad chest, directly over his heart. Her paws kneaded into his winter coat. She was purring not the casual, contented purr of a cat seeking warmth, but something deeper, more intentional. The sound resonated through the barn like a healing song, rhythmic and hypnotic. Atlas's eyes were closed, his massive head relaxed against the straw. For the first time in months, his face held no trace of the desperate grief that had been consuming him. He looked peaceful. More than peaceful, he looked like he was actually sleeping. Real sleep, not the exhausted collapse that had become his norm. Tom crept closer, afraid to break whatever spell was happening before his eyes. Whiskers noticed his approach but didn't move, just fixed him with those mismatched eyes as if to say, "I've got this." Her purring never faltered, a constant vibration that seemed to flow directly into Atlas's chest. "What are you doing, girl?" Tom whispered as if in response, Whiskers shifted slightly, repositioning herself more securely on Atlas's chest. The bull's breathing hitched for a moment, then settled back into that same deep, restful rhythm. One massive eye opened slightly, caught Tom's flashlight beam, then drifted closed again. There was something different in that brief glimpse, not the hollow despair Tom had grown accustomed to, but a flicker of something that might have been contentment. Tom lowered himself onto a hay bale, hardly daring to breathe. He'd heard of therapy animals, of course dogs that could detect seizures, horses that helped traumatized children, dolphins that worked with autistic kids. But this? A barn cat providing emotional support to a grieving bull? It defied everything. He thought he knew about animal behavior, yet there was no denying what he was seeing. Atlas's breathing was deeper and more regular than it had been in months. His body, which had been held rigid with grief and pain, was finally relaxed. Even his color seemed better in the dim light, less of that sickly yellow tinge that had been. Creeping into his coat, Whiskers had positioned herself with scientific precision, her small body centered over Atlas's heart, her purrs timed to match his heartbeat. It was as if she understood exactly what he needed, not food, not medicine, not false comfort, but simple, steady presence. The assurance that he wasn't alone in his grief. Tom found himself thinking about the nights after Margaret's diagnosis, when the fear and uncertainty had made sleep impossible. He'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, listening to her labored breathing, terrified that each breath might be her last. Whiskers had appeared during those dark hours too, curling up on Margaret's chest just like this, purring that same deep healing song. Tom had assumed she was just seeking warmth from the fever, but now he wondered if Whiskers had been providing the same comfort to his dying wife that she was offering to Atlas, the same steady presence, the same promise that death didn't have to be faced alone. Hours passed in the barn's peaceful quiet. Tom dozed fitfully on the hay bale, jerking awake periodically to check on his unlikely pair. Each time, he found them in the same position, Whiskers maintaining her vigil, Atlas sleeping more peacefully than he had since Rosie's death. At 5:30 a.m., as the first gray light began filtering through the barn windows, Tom heard something that made his breath catch. Atlas was drinking. Not the desperate, mechanical lapping of an animal forcing itself to survive, but the steady, purposeful drinking of a creature that had remembered thirst. Whiskers had moved to Atlas's shoulder, still purring, still maintaining contact, but no longer directly over his heart. The bull was fully awake now, his head raised, his eyes clear and focused. When he saw Tom watching, Atlas actually snorted a sound hadn't heard from him in months. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom breathed. At 7:45 a.m., Dr. Chun's truck appeared in the driveway. Tom met her at the barn door, his decision crystallizing with each step. "Dr. Chun," he said as she approached with her medical bag, "I need to ask you something. What if we were wrong? What if he's not ready to give up?" She looked past into Atlas's stall, where the bull was standing alert and calm, Whiskers still perched on his broad back like a tiny orange flag of hope. "Mr. McKenzie," she said slowly, her voice filled with wonder, "what happened here?" "Doctor." Chun's truck crunched over frost as she arrived with her black medical bag. Tom's heart hammered against his ribs as he led her toward the barn, but stopped short at Atlas's stall. There, impossibly, Whiskers still lay curled on the bull's massive chest, both breathing in peaceful rhythm. Atlas had drunk half his water trough overnight. "I can't do it," Tom whispered, his voice cracking. "Not when she's fighting this hard for him." Dr. Chun studied the unprecedented scene, her clinical skepticism warring with wonder. 2 weeks, she said finally. "Let's see what your cat can accomplish that veterinary science says is impossible." The morning sun painted golden streaks across the barn floor as Tom McKenzie sat on an overturned milk crate, watching something that defied every bit of ranching wisdom he'd accumulated over 5 decades. Whiskers had maintained her vigil on Atlas's chest for 3 consecutive nights now, and the changes in the massive Hereford were undeniable, if subtle. "Day 4, Tom muttered, scratching notes into a composition notebook he'd found buried in Margaret's old desk drawer. His handwriting, grown shaky with age and disuse, crawled across the lined pages like uncertain fence wire. "Atlas ate 2 pounds of hay this morning. Still won't touch the grain, but it's something." The bull's massive head turned at the sound of Tom's voice, dark eyes holding a clarity that had been absent for months. Not the bright alertness Atlas had possessed before Rosie's death, but no longer the hollow stare of an animal waiting to die. Whiskers stretched on his chest, her orange fur catching the light like burnished copper, and began her morning purr, a sound that had become the soundtrack to their unlikely recovery. Dr. Chun arrived precisely at 9, as she had every morning since postponing the euthanasia. Her initial skepticism hadn't vanished, but it had evolved into something more complex, professional curiosity tempered by genuine hope. She carried a different bag today, one filled with monitoring equipment rather than the tools of ending. "Any changes overnight?" she asked, approaching Atlas's stall with the careful respect one shows a recovering patient rather than a condemned animal. "He walked to the water trough twice," Tom said, pride creeping into his voice despite his efforts to remain objective. "And he's been chewing cud for the past hour. First time I've seen that since ... He didn't need to finish." Dr. Chun nodded, understanding the weight of small victories. She'd been practicing veterinary medicine for 8 years, but she'd never documented a case quite like this one. Her professors at Colorado State had taught her about the psychological complexities of large animals, but nothing in her textbooks had prepared her for a cat who seemed to understand grief better than most. "Humans, let me get some readings," she said, pulling out a stethoscope and digital thermometer. Atlas stood calmly as she approached, Whiskers maintaining her position with the confidence of a medical professional. His heart rate's down to normal range, temperature's good. "Sarah, this shouldn't be possible." She addressed herself by name, a habit she'd developed during difficult cases. But this wasn't difficult, it was miraculous. The sound of an approaching truck interrupted their morning ritual. Through the barn's open door, Tom watched Frank Rodriguez climb down from his battered Ford pickup, carrying a thermos and what appeared to be a bag of pastries from Miller's Bakery in town. "Figured you folks might need some coffee and sustenance," Frank called out, his weathered face creasing into a smile. At 62, Frank had the easy manner of a man who'd made peace with life's surprises. He'd been Tom's neighbor for 15 years, watching from respectful distance as the McKenzie ranch slowly crumbled under the weight of medical bills and falling cattle prices. "Don't suppose you brought any for our patient?" Dr. Chun asked, nodding toward Atlas. She developed a dry sense of humor about the case, a defense mechanism against the wonder that threatened to overwhelm her scientific training. "Matter of fact," Frank said, pulling a handful of apples from his jacket pocket, "I brought these from my orchard. Won't hurt to try." He approached Atlas's stall with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd spent his life around large animals. Whiskers watched him carefully but didn't abandon her post. Frank held out an apple, and after a moment's hesitation, Atlas lowered his massive head and accepted the offering. The crunch of teeth on fruit seemed impossibly loud in the quiet barn. Tom felt tears prick his eyes, the first time Atlas had shown interest in treats since Rosie's death. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank murmured. "Pardon my language, but that's something special right there." Dr. Chun made another note on her tablet, documenting everything. The veterinary journal that would eventually publish her case study was still months away, but she was already thinking about how to describe what they were witnessing. How do you quantify love? How do you measure the healing power of refusing? To give up? "I've been thinking," Frank continued, settling onto a hay bale with his coffee. "My grandfather used to tell stories about animals like your Whiskers here. Said some creatures are born with an extra sense about suffering. Called them heart healers." Tom looked up from his notebook. In all their years as neighbors, Frank had never mentioned his grandfather's stories. "Your grandfather was a rancher?" "Horse trainer, actually. Worked with cavalry mounts back in the day, then switched to therapeutic riding after the war. He always said the best healers weren't always human." Whiskers chose that moment to shift position on Atlas's chest, stretching each paw methodically before settling back into her healing pose. The bull's breathing deepened, a sound of contentment that Tom hadn't heard in months. "She knows exactly what she's doing," Dr. Chun observed, watching the cat's movements with professional interest. "It's not random comfort, it's targeted therapy." Over the following hours, they established what would become their daily routine. Tom would arrive at dawn to check on Atlas and record any changes. Dr. Chun would conduct her medical assessment mid-morning. Frank would stop by with coffee and practical wisdom, often staying to help with minor repairs, or simply to witness the ongoing miracle. And through it all, Whiskers maintained her vigil, sleeping on Atlas's chest each night, and providing comfort with the dedication of a registered nurse. She seemed to understand that her patient was fragile, that healing required patience and consistency. By evening, as Tom prepared to head back to his cabin, Atlas had consumed nearly 5 pounds of hay, 2 apples, and had even shown curiosity about the grain bucket. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. "See you in the morning, big guy," Tom said, reaching through the stall bars to pat Atlas's flank. The bull's skin twitched at the touch, not in alarm, but in acknowledgement. Whiskers purred her response, settling in for another night of healing. 2 weeks into what Tom had started calling the miracle, Dr. Chun arrived at the barn carrying equipment that looked more suited to a research hospital than a rural veterinary practice. The portable EKG machine, pulse oximeter, and digital recording devices represented favors called in from her former colleagues at the university veterinary program. "I need to understand what's actually happening here," she explained to Tom as they watched Whiskers assume her nightly position on Atlas's chest. "The improvements are too consistent to be coincidental." Atlas now weighed 30 pounds more than his lowest point. His coat had regained some of its former luster, and most remarkably, he'd begun following Tom and Whiskers around the small property during their morning walks. The bull who'd once stood motionless in Rosie's death spot now showed curiosity about his surroundings, investigating new scents and even attempting playful head tosses that reminded Tom of Atlas's younger days. "You think there's actual science behind what she's doing?" Tom asked, watching as Dr. Chun carefully attached monitoring leads to Atlas's massive frame. The bull stood patiently, as if understanding the importance of the procedure. "I think," Dr. Chun said, adjusting the equipment, "that we're about to find out." The first night of monitoring revealed data that challenged everything Dr. Chun thought she knew about interspecies interaction. Whiskers' purring, which registered at precisely 25 Hz on the frequency monitor, corresponded with measurable changes in Atlas's heart rate variability, stress hormone levels, and even brainwave patterns, picked up by the portable EEG. "Look at this," Dr. Chun said the next morning, showing Tom the printouts that covered her truck's tailgate like evidence in a scientific investigation. "When Whiskers starts purring, Atlas's cortisol levels drop by 30% within 20 minutes. His heart rate moves into what we call coherent patterns, the same rhythms we see in deep, restorative sleep." Frank arrived with his usual coffee delivery, just as Dr. Chen was explaining the implications of her findings. "So you're saying the little lady there is basically giving Atlas therapy sessions every night?" "More than that," Dr. Chun replied, her excitement evident despite her attempt at clinical detachment. "She's providing targeted healing at a frequency that promotes bone regeneration, reduces inflammation, and triggers the release of healing hormones. It's like she instinctively knows exactly what Atlas needs." Tom studied the readouts, seeing his livestock through new eyes. "Margaret always said animals know things we don't. Said they're closer to the source of wisdom than we are." Frank nodded knowingly. "My grandfather would have called this the old knowing. Said some creatures are born with it, an understanding of how to heal that goes deeper than learning." As if responding to their conversation, Whiskers opened one green eye from her perch on Atlas's chest and regarded them with what Tom could only describe as mild amusement before returning to her purring meditation. "I've been reading about similar cases," Dr. Chun continued, pulling out a tablet loaded with research papers. "There's documented evidence of cats providing healing therapy to humans with PTSD, depression, even chronic pain. The frequency of their purring falls within ranges that promote healing at the cellular level. But a cat choosing to heal a bull? Tom asked. That's what makes this extraordinary. Cross-species empathy at this level is virtually unheard of. Whiskers isn't just providing comfort, she's actively treating Atlas's condition with the precision of a trained therapist. Over the following days, the monitoring equipment revealed the full scope of Whiskers' therapeutic intervention. She adjusted her purring frequency based on Atlas's stress levels, moved to different positions on his chest to target specific areas of tension, and even timed her sessions to coincide with Atlas's natural healing cycles. She's reading his biorhythms, Dr. Chun explained during one of their evening observation sessions. Watch how she shifts position when his breathing changes. She's responding to cues we can't even detect. Frank, who'd become an unofficial member of their research team, shared stories that provided historical context for what they were witnessing. My grandfather told me about a horse named Thunder who wouldn't eat after his rider died in Korea. Wasted away just like Atlas here. Then a barn cat started sleeping with him, and within a month, Thunder was leading trail rides again. Did your grandfather ever explain how it worked? Dr. Chun asked, genuinely curious about folk wisdom that might inform her scientific understanding. Said some animals are born knowing that healing happens when one heart teaches another how to beat strong. Again, Corsi was part Cherokee, so he understood things differently than most folks. The breakthrough came during the third week of monitoring. Dr. Chun discovered that Whiskers' healing sessions weren't just helping Atlas, they were teaching him to self-regulate his emotional responses. The bull's stress patterns were becoming more resilient, his recovery periods shorter, his overall emotional stability dramatically improved. She's not just treating symptoms, Dr. Chun realized aloud. She's helping him develop coping mechanisms. It's like cognitive behavioral therapy. For cattle. Tom laughed despite himself. You going to put that in your veterinary journal? Actually, yes. This data could revolutionize how we treat trauma in large animals. If we can understand and replicate what Whiskers is doing naturally. That evening, as they watched Atlas explore the far corner of his paddock for the first time since Rosie's death, Tom felt something shift in his own chest. The tight knot of grief that had lived there for 2 years loosened slightly, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. You know what I think? He said to Frank and Dr. Chun as they packed up the monitoring equipment. I think Whiskers didn't just save Atlas. I think she's been healing all of us. Whiskers, overhearing her name, chirped once from her position on Atlas's back as the bull grazed contentedly in the evening light. The sound seemed to carry agreement, as if she'd known all along that healing rarely happens in isolation. It spreads like ripples in still water, touching everyone willing to believe in the possibility of second chances. The story of Atlas's miraculous recovery had spread through Montana's tight-knit ranching community like wildfire through dry grass. Tom first learned about the attention when Jake Miller from the feed store called to say someone from Billings had driven 3 hours just to ask about the cat that heals bulls. Word's getting around, Tom, Jake said over the phone. Might want to prepare yourself for visitors. Tom hung up feeling uneasy. He'd never been comfortable with attention, preferring the quiet rhythms of ranch life to the complications that came with publicity. But the knock on his cabin door that Tuesday morning brought visitors he couldn't have anticipated. Elena Martinez stood on his porch holding the hand of her 8-year-old daughter Sofia, while her husband Carlos waited by their horse trailer. Elena's eyes held the particular desperation Tom recognized from his own mirror during Atlas's darkest days. Mr. McKenzie? I'm sorry to bother you, but we heard about your bull and your cat, Elena began, her voice tight with controlled emotion. We have a horse Luna, and we don't know what else to try. Tom invited them to sit on his porch while Carlos led Luna from the trailer. The Mare was a beautiful paint horse, her coat a patchwork of white and chestnut, but her behavior told a story of trauma that made Tom's chest ache. Luna stood with her head low, muscles twitching at every sound, eyes wide with persistent fear. "She was in a barn fire 6 months ago," Carlos explained, his weathered hands gentle on the lead rope. "Lost her foal and barely escaped herself. Since then, she won't eat properly, won't let anyone ride her, won't even go into a stall. The vet says her injuries healed fine, but her heart didn't," Sophia finished quietly, and Tom saw tears threatening in the little girl's eyes. "Luna was my best friend before the fire. Now she acts like she doesn't even know me." Tom felt the familiar weight of impossible decisions settling on his shoulders. He'd never intended to become some kind of animal healer he could barely manage his own grief, let alone take on someone else's. But something in Sophia's face reminded him of Margaret, who'd never been able to turn away from suffering. "I'm not sure what we can do," he said carefully. "What happened with Atlas, that was just ... a miracle," Elena said. "We know, but Sophia hasn't smiled in 6 months, and Luna gets worse every day. We were going to ... we scheduled ... She couldn't finish the sentence. "You were going to put her down," Tom said gently. "It wasn't a question." Carlos nodded, his jaw tight. "Thursday morning. But then we heard about your bull, and Elena thought maybe ... A small orange blur shot past Tom's legs, and suddenly Whiskers was approaching Luna with the same focused attention she'd once shown Atlas. The mare's head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring as she caught the cat's scent. For the first time since arriving, Luna's ears pricked forward instead of laying flat against her skull. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom murmured, watching as Whiskers circled Luna at a respectful distance, her tail held high in greeting. "She's never done that with any other animal." Whiskers sat down about 10 feet from Luna and began her characteristic purr, not the intense healing frequency she used with Atlas, but something softer, more inviting. Luna took a tentative step forward, then another, until she stood directly above the small cat. "She remembers," Sophia whispered, wonder replacing despair in her voice. "She remembers cats. We had barn cats before the fire." Frank's truck rumbled up the drive at that moment, followed by Dr. Chen's sedan. Tom had called them both when the Martinez family arrived, knowing he'd need support for whatever decision lay ahead. "Looks like we've got ourselves a consultation," Frank said, climbing down from his truck with his usual unhurried manner. He took in the scene, the traumatized horse, the desperate family, and Whiskers sitting beneath Luna like she'd found her next patient. Dr. Chen approached with professional interest, but Tom could see the excitement in her eyes. After 3 weeks of documenting Atlas's recovery, she'd become as invested in Whiskers' abilities as any of them. Trauma-induced behavioral changes, she diagnosed after a brief examination of Luna. Very similar to what we saw with Atlas, but potentially more complex because of the association with fire and loss of offspring. "Can Whiskers help her?" Sophia asked, her small hand finding Tom's weathered one. Tom looked down at the little girl, seeing hope and heartbreak in equal measure. He thought about Margaret, who'd always said their ranch was meant to be a place where broken things could heal. He thought about Atlas, now grazing peacefully in the paddock, proof that miracles were possible. And he thought about the empty years since Margaret's death, when he'd forgotten that purpose could emerge from the ashes of loss. "Well," he said slowly, making a decision that would change everything, "I suppose we could try. But I can't promise anything except that we'll give her the same chance we gave Atlas." Elena's eyes filled with tears of relief. "That's all we're asking for." Carlos nodded firmly. "We'll pay whatever." "No payment," Tom interrupted. "But if we do this, it's not just for a few days. Real healing takes time, and Luna will need consistency. You'll have to bring her here every day, or we could set up the camper," Carlos said quickly. "Stay here until she's better." Tom felt something unlock in his chest, a door he'd kept barred since Margaret's death. "There's electrical hookup behind the barn." "Frank, you think you could help me clear a space?" "Already thinking about it," Frank replied with a grin that suggested he'd been hoping for exactly this moment. As they made plans for Luna's extended stay, Whiskers maintained her position beneath the mare, purring softly while Luna gradually relaxed for the first time in months. Atlas, drawn by the commotion, wandered over to investigate and stood nearby like a gentle guardian, watching two broken animals find comfort in an unlikely community. Tom realized that real healing rarely happened in isolation. Sometimes it took a village, even if that village consisted of a grieving old man, a wise cat, a recovered bull, and people willing to believe in second chances. 3 weeks after Luna's arrival, Tom's small property had transformed into something he'd never imagined possible. The Martinez family's camper sat nestled behind the barn, electrical lines snaking through the grass like lifelines. Carlos had proven invaluable with repairs, fixing fence posts that had leaned crooked since Tom's financial troubles began. Elena's gentle way with traumatized animals had become essential as word continued to spread about the Miracle Ranch. But it was the arrival of Buddy, a blind collie mix abandoned at the county shelter, that forced Tom to confront the magnitude of what they were building. "We can't keep taking them all in," Tom said to Frank as they watched Whiskers approach the trembling dog with her characteristic assessment purr. "I barely scraped together enough feed for Atlas and Luna." Frank, who'd been helping to construct additional shelter spaces with materials donated by sympathetic locals, paused in his hammering. "Tom, you remember what Margaret used to say about rivers?" Tom's throat tightened at the mention of his wife. "She said a lot of things about rivers. She said you can't stop a river by building a dam. You can only direct it toward where it needs to go." Frank gestured toward Whiskers, who'd somehow convinced the blind dog to lie down while she settled beside him. "This thing that's happening here, it's bigger than any of us planned. Question is, do we fight it or do we build something worthy of it?" Dr. Chun arrived that afternoon with news that complicated everything. "I've been contacted by the State Veterinary Board," she announced, her expression unreadable. "They want to conduct an official investigation into what we're doing here." Tom's blood chilled. "Investigation?" "Not the bad kind," she assured him quickly. "They want to study Whiskers' healing methods for potential application in veterinary therapy programs. There's talk of grants, research funding, maybe even establishing this as an official animal rehabilitation center." Carlos looked up from the fence post he'd been setting. "What would that mean?" "It would mean resources," Dr. Chun explained. "Proper facilities, veterinary equipment, funding for feed and medical care. But it would also mean regulations, inspections, documentation requirements." Tom felt the familiar panic that had haunted him since losing the ranch. "I can't handle that kind of responsibility again. What if I fail? What if you don't?" Elena interrupted gently, approaching with Sophia, who'd been helping to groom Luna. "Mr. McKenzie, Sophia hasn't had nightmares since we've been here. Luna's eating normally again. Buddy hasn't cowered once since Whiskers started working with him. How was any of that failure?" That night, Tom found himself standing in the barn at 2 a.m., watching Whiskers divide her attention between 3 patients. She'd somehow established a rotation system 30 minutes with Luna, who still flinched at sudden sounds, but no longer refused human contact. An hour with Atlas, who served as her original patient and anchor point. And focused sessions with Buddy, whose confidence grew daily under her patient guidance. "You're making this look easy," Tom murmured to the cat, who paused in her ministrations to fix him with an amber stare that seemed far too knowing. "But I don't know if I'm strong enough to build what you're asking for." The memory hit him without warning. Margaret in their kitchen 3 years ago, flour in her hair, laughing as she attempted to teach him to bake bread for the church fundraiser. "Tom McKenzie," she'd said, flour-dusted hands on her hips, "you raised cattle for 30 years. managed 1,000-acre spreads, and survived more market crashes than I can count. Don't tell me you're intimidated by a little yeast. He'd protested that bread-making required precision he didn't possess, that one mistake could ruin the whole batch. Margaret had smiled that patient smile he missed more than breathing. Honey, the secret isn't avoiding mistakes. It's learning what to do when the dough doesn't rise the way you planned. Sometimes the best bread comes from the batches that looked hopeless. Tom jolted back to the present as Whiskers chirped softly, as if she'd been listening to his memories. Atlas shifted in his stall, and Luna nickered gently in response sounds of contentment that would have been impossible a month ago. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Dr. James Harrison from Montana State University's veterinary program arrived with a proposal that left everyone speechless. We want to establish a partnership, he explained to the assembled group over Elena's coffee and homemade biscuits. The university provides resources. Students gain hands-on experience in innovative therapy techniques, and this facility becomes a teaching center for interspecies healing. Teaching center? Tom repeated, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. What Whiskers is doing here naturally, we could potentially teach to other therapy animals. Imagine the implications for PTSD treatment, elderly care facilities, children's hospitals. Your cat has stumbled onto something revolutionary. Frank chuckled. I don't think Whiskers stumbled onto anything. Pretty sure she knew exactly what she was doing from day one. Dr. Harrison pulled out architectural drawings that made Tom's head spin. We're talking about a state-of-the-art facility. Proper veterinary suite, rehabilitation spaces, housing for long-term residents, quarters for visiting families. The whole operation would be funded through research grants and university partnerships. And I'd run this place? Tom asked, overwhelmed by the scope of the proposal. You'd be the director, Dr. Harrison confirmed. Your experience, combined with documented success cases, makes you the ideal candidate. We're not trying to take over, we want to support what you've already built. Sophia tugged on Tom's sleeve. Mr. McKenzie, would this mean more animals like Luna could get better? Tom looked around at the faces surrounding him, Carlos and Elena, who'd found hope when they'd lost all expectation of it. Dr. Chun, whose scientific curiosity had evolved into passionate advocacy. Frank, whose quiet wisdom had anchored them all. And Sophia, whose smile had returned along with her horse's healing dot in the center of it all, sat Whiskers, washing a paw with characteristic feline nonchalance, as if healing traumatized animals and transforming broken-down ranches into centers of hope was simply Tuesday's work. Margaret always said the best things in life happen when you stop trying to control the river and start building bridges instead. Tom said slowly, his decision crystallizing. I think it's time we built something worthy of what Whiskers started. The cheer that erupted from the group startled Buddy, but instead of cowering, the blind dog's tail began to wag, the first time anyone had seen him express joy since his arrival. Sometimes, Tom realized, the greatest act of faith isn't believing in miracles. It's believing you're worthy of building something miraculous. 6 months after Atlas's near-death experience, the transformation of Tom's 5 acres had attracted attention far beyond Montana's ranching community. The documentary crew from National Geographic arrived on a crisp October morning, their equipment trucks navigating the improved gravel road that the university partnership had funded. Tom stood on his porch, watching the controlled chaos of camera setup with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. The man who'd once hidden from creditors now found himself preparing to share his story with millions of viewers worldwide. You nervous? Dr. Chun asked, joining him on the porch. She'd driven over early to help coordinate the filming, her role having evolved from skeptical veterinarian to co-director of what was now officially called the McKenzie Center for Interspecies Healing. Terrified, Tom admitted honestly. What if I say something stupid? What if people think we're just lucky fools playing with hurt animals? Frank appeared around the corner of the barn, leading a small parade that made Tom's heart swell with quiet pride. Atlas walked with confident strides, his massive frame restored to full health, while Whiskers rode on his back like a small orange queen surveying her domain. Behind them followed Luna, now serving as a therapy horse for visiting children with trauma, and Buddy, whose blindness had become irrelevant as he navigated the property with sure-footed confidence. "Doesn't look like luck to me," Frank said with a grin. "Looks like about 6 months of hard work and a cat who refuses to give up on anything with a heartbeat." The documentary director, an intense woman named Rebecca Martinez, approached with her camera operator in tow. "Mr. McKenzie, I'm Rebecca. Thank you for agreeing to share your story." "Call me Tom," he said, shaking her hand. "And I should thank you. Margaret always said stories have power when they're shared with the right intentions." Rebecca's expression softened. "Your wife sounds like she was a wise woman." "Still is," Tom replied simply. "Just speaks to me differently now." The filming began with establishing shots of the animals moving freely around the expanded property. The university partnership had funded the construction of proper rehabilitation facilities, spacious enclosures, a modern veterinary clinic, and comfortable quarters for visiting families. But what impressed the documentary crew most was the obvious contentment of the animals and the easy collaboration between species. "Cut," Rebecca called after capturing footage of Whiskers leading a session with a rescued donkey named Hope. "Tom, can you explain what we just witnessed? Because that cat appeared to be teaching that donkey breathing exercises." Tom laughed, the sound coming easier now than it had in years. "Whiskers has developed what Dr. Chun calls therapeutic protocols. She assesses each animal's needs and develops specific treatment approaches. We've documented her working with 14 different species now." Dr. Chun stepped forward, tablet in hand. "What's remarkable is the consistency of her methods. She uses different purring frequencies for different conditions. 25 Hz for anxiety, 35 Hz for physical pain, 50 Hz for what we can only call grief counseling. And she trains other animals to continue the work when she's not available." "You mean she's teaching therapy techniques to other animals?" Rebecca asked, clearly fascinated. "Atlas has become her primary assistant," Tom explained, gesturing toward the massive bull who was standing patiently while a skittish rescue goat found courage to approach. "He provides what we call anchoring presence, a calm, steady energy that helps traumatized animals feel safe enough to begin healing." The most powerful footage came during an unscripted moment. Sophia Martinez, now 9 and a frequent volunteer, at the center, was working with a newly arrived horse who'd been found wandering a highway after a trailer accident. The mare was wild with fear, refusing all human contact. Whiskers appeared as if summoned, approaching the terrified horse with her characteristic assessment routine. But instead of beginning her usual purring therapy, she looked directly at Sophia and gave a soft chirp that somehow conveyed instruction. Sophia understood immediately. She sat down 10 feet from the horse and began humming a lullaby her grandmother had taught her, while Whiskers positioned herself between the girl and the mare. Within minutes, the horse's ears had pricked forward, her breathing had slowed, and she'd taken tentative steps toward the unlikely therapy team. "That's not random," Rebecca murmured to her camera operator. "That cat is directing the therapeutic intervention." Dr. Chun was recording everything on her tablet, her excitement barely contained. "Whiskers has never done that before directing human participation in her healing sessions. She's expanding her therapeutic protocols to include human caregivers." The breakthrough moment came when the horse finally approached close enough for Sophia to touch her nose. The mare's eyes, which had shown only fear and confusion since her arrival, suddenly reflected something different: recognition of safety, the possibility of trust. "She knows she's home," Sophia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She knows we won't hurt her." Rebecca kept filming as Tom felt his own eyes water. In that moment, he understood something profound about what they'd built. It wasn't just a place where broken animals came to heal. It was a place where broken hearts of all species learned to trust again. That evening, as the documentary crew packed their equipment, Rebecca approached Tom with an expression of genuine wonder. "I've filmed stories around the world," she said. "War zones, natural disasters, scientific breakthroughs. But I've never seen anything quite like what you've created here. It's not just animal rehabilitation, it's something deeper." Tom looked around at his transformed property, where animals and humans moved together in peaceful cooperation, where Whiskers continued her rounds with the dedication of a medical professional, where hope had replaced despair in ways he'd never thought possible. "Margaret used to say that love creates its own miracles," he replied. "I think what we've got here is proof that she was right. Sometimes the smallest acts of refusing to give up become the biggest gifts we can offer the world." As the documentary trucks disappeared down the gravel road, Tom felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with fame or recognition. They'd taken something broken, a dying bull, a grieving man, a small cat with an oversized heart, and built it into something that would help heal others for years to come. The real miracle wasn't that Whiskers could heal animals. The real miracle was that love, once shared freely, multiplies beyond anything science can measure. 1 year to the day after Tom had scheduled Atlas's euthanization, the McKenzie Center for Interspecies Healing hosted its first anniversary celebration. The crisp November morning sparkled with frost that reminded Tom of that terrible day when he'd nearly given up on everything. But the scene before him now defied every dark prediction his grief had whispered. 40-3 animals called the center. Home horses, cattle, dogs, cats, goats, sheep, and even a rehabilitated hawk named Phoenix who'd learned to trust humans again after surviving a wildfire. Each had arrived broken in some way, and each had found healing through the mysterious therapeutic protocols that Whiskers had developed and taught to her growing team of assistant healers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom said into the microphone. Frank had insisted they needed for the crowd of visitors, supporters, and media representatives gathered on the main lawn. "A year ago, I was a broken man ready to give up on my last bull. Today, Atlas weighs 2,200 pounds and serves as a therapy animal for children with PTSD." The crowd applauded as Atlas ambled forward, Whiskers riding regally on his broad back. The bull's transformation was complete. His coat gleamed with health, his eyes sparkled with intelligence, and his gentle demeanor had made him the perfect ambassador for traumatized animals everywhere. "But this celebration isn't about one miraculous recovery," Tom continued, finding his voice stronger than he'd ever imagined possible. "It's about what happens when we refuse to accept that healing is impossible, when we trust in connections we don't fully understand, and when we build something worthy of the love we've been given." Dr. Chun stepped forward, her research tablet replaced by a proclamation from the State Veterinary Board. "The McKenzie Center has been officially recognized as Montana's first certified interspecies therapy facility. Tom McKenzie has been appointed as the state's director of animal-assisted healing research." The announcement brought cheers from the crowd, but Tom's attention was drawn to movement near the barn. Whiskers had climbed down from Atlas's back and was approaching a group of veterinary students who'd arrived with the latest rescue case, a young calf orphaned in a ranch accident. "Excuse me," Tom said into the microphone, his voice filled with wonder even after witnessing her work hundreds of times. "Whiskers is about to demonstrate why she's the real director of this operation." The crowd turned to watch as the small orange cat began her assessment routine with the frightened calf. Her purrs started at the familiar 25 Hz frequency for anxiety reduction, while Atlas positioned himself nearby as an anchoring presence. Within minutes, Luna had joined them, offering her own form of comfort, followed by Buddy, whose blindness allowed him to approach without triggering the calf's flight response. "This is what we call the cascade effect," Dr. Chun explained to the mesmerized audience. Whiskers initiates the healing protocol, then other animals join to provide specialized support based on their own recovery experiences. They're teaching each other to heal. Sophia Martinez, now 10 and an official volunteer, approached the calf with the confident patience Whiskers had taught her. "It's okay, little one," she whispered, sitting beside the therapy team. "Everyone here knows what it feels like to be scared and alone. But you're not alone anymore." The calf's transformation happened in real time before the watching crowd. Fear melted into curiosity, then into tentative trust as Whiskers worked her inexplicable magic. By the end of the demonstration, the orphaned animal was nursing from a bottle Sophia offered, surrounded by a multi-species support group that defied every conventional understanding of animal behavior. "How do you explain what we just witnessed?" a reporter called out. Tom looked around at the faces surrounding him. Frank, who'd become the center's operations manager. Elena and Carlos, who now ran the family support programs. Dr. Chun, whose research had revolutionized veterinary approaches to trauma. And dozens of families whose lives had been touched by the healing that happened here. "I can't explain it scientifically," Tom said honestly. "But Margaret, my late wife, always said that some things don't need explaining, they just need experiencing. What I can tell you is that love refuses to accept limitations. It finds ways to heal that bypass everything we think we know about. What's possible?" As the celebration continued around them, Tom found a quiet moment to visit Margaret's grave, which now overlooked the thriving sanctuary from a hill beside the barn. Whiskers had followed him, as she often did during these private moments. "Well, honey," Tom said to the headstone, his voice thick with emotion, "you always said this place was meant to heal broken things. Turns out you were talking about more than just the land." Whiskers chirped once and rubbed against his leg, her purr carrying the same healing frequency that had saved Atlas and launched a revolution in interspecies therapy. In the distance, the sound of children's laughter mixed with the gentle voices of animals who'd found their second chances. Tom McKenzie had given up on his bull once, ready to choose despair over hope. But Whiskers had refused to accept that choice. Sleeping on Atlas's chest until morning brought the possibility of healing. Now, as the sun set over a sanctuary, broken hearts learned to beat strong again. Tom understood the deepest truth. Margaret had tried to teach him, love doesn't give up, and neither should we.